The first step to defining a custom field type is implementing hook field info and providing Drupal with some basic metadata about our field. Things like the human readable label for our field type and the default widget and formatter to use for the field. In this lesson, we'll start by implementing hook field info. Then, in order to get our field to show up in the admin UI, we'll need to define a default widget and formatter. Since those don't exist yet for our field, we'll implement hook field widget info and hook field formatter info, providing just the basics that are required to get our field to show in the UI. We'll come back later and talk more in depth about each of those hooks in later lessons. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to implement hook field info, then enable your module and see your new field type show up in the list of field type options in the administrative user interface. The first thing we'll want to do is look at the documentation for hook field info. So I've pulled this up on api.drupal.org. And hook field info is the hook that we'll need to implement in our RGB module in order to provide some really basic metadata about our new custom field type. This hook returns an array, a multi-dimensional array that defines the field type or field types provided by our module. In this case, we're just going to have one field type, the RGB color field. The keys of that array contain things like label, the human readable name of the field type, and a short description that's used. Both of those will show up in the administrative interface when someone's adding our field to a bundle. We can also define things like the default widget and default formatter to use when somebody adds our field to a bundle. If you scroll down to the bottom of the documentation here, you can see an example implementation of hook field info. This is taken directly from the text module in Drupal core. And this is the hook field info implementation for the text field, the long text field, or the text with summary field, often seen as the body field on article content types or page content types. So we're going to be creating one of these in our module to get started. If I switch over to my code, in my editor, in the rgb.module file, I'm going to start by just implementing hook field info. The hook field info function takes no arguments, so we just make sure and use our module name here, underscore field underscore info, and it returns an array. So I'll just go ahead and say return an array. And this is a multi-dimensional array. The key that I define here in this array will ultimately become the sort of machine readable name of our field type. For the text module, you saw there was text and text underscore long, etc. I'm going to name ours RGB underscore color. You might be tempted to just name this something like color, but best practice is to always prefix these field type names with the name of your module, hence the RGB underscore color here. And then that's going to be an array where we add the label and the default widget and default formatter. So I'm going to add a label and a description. The label and description are just those human readable aspects that will be shown in the administrative interface. I also need to provide a default widget and a default formatter. So default widget and default formatter. However, these don't exist yet since we haven't provided a widget or a formatter. You could, if you wanted to, do something like reuse a widget from another module by saying default widget is the text field provided by the text module, and the default formatter is the one provided by the text module as well. We're going to be creating our own though, so I'm going to go ahead and just make up names for these to start out with. Again, I like to prefix these with the name of my module, so I'm going to call this one RGB text field and RGB raw. So our basic widget for collecting data from users will be just a simple text field, and our basic formatter for displaying information to users will just be raw output. Ultimately, we'll just print out the string of text that someone entered into the field. So I can save that. So I've now got a really basic implementation of hook field info. The unique ID of our field type, RGB color, its label, description, and information about the default widget and formatter. All of these are required in order for our field to even show up in the administrative user interface. There's a couple of additional keys that I could put into this array that we don't need for our particular implementation, but there's a settings and instance settings keys that can be used to provide default settings for both the field type and for field instances. With this in place, I'm also going to need to implement hook field widget info to describe our widget and hook field formatter info. Let's take a look at the documentation for the hook field widget info. I've pulled up the documentation on Drupal.org. This function does essentially the same thing. It provides metadata, but in this case, instead of providing metadata about the field type, we're going to be providing data about the widget. This is that whole thing we talked about before where there are three components to defining a custom field type. The field type itself, or what type of data you're storing, the widget for collecting information, and what we'll get to next, the formatter. This hook, it returns an array describing the widget types implemented by the module. The keys are the widget type names. To avoid clashes, names should be prefixed with the name of the module that exposes them. Okay? And then the list of possible keys that you could use in your array defining your widget, the label and the description, the field types that this widget applies to. Okay, important, we'll remember that. Settings and behaviors, and an optional weight. There's also an example implementation here. Again, pulled from the text module in Drupal core. So if we switch back to our code, the next thing we'll want to add is an implementation of hook field widget info. It'll look like this. Just like hook field info, hook field widget info takes no arguments and it just returns an array. So we'll return array like so. The key of the array here is the name of our widget. So if you remember when we defined hook field info up here, we said that our default widget is going to be named RGB text field. That means this key needs to match up with the widget we defined down here. So I'll just copy and paste that. And then that's an array that's going to describe to the field API what an RGB text field widget looks like. So we'll give it a label, RGB text fields, and we need to tell the field API which field types this widget works for. So in our case, this is the RGB color field. The field type, again, defined up here in hook field info. We said ours is RGB color. I'll just copy and paste that down here. This is indicative of the fact that widgets can be created by one module, but can be used for multiple different field types. So it'd be possible for the file module, for example, provides the file field upload widget, which the image module reuses in order to display images. In our case, we're just having a one-to-one correlation between our field type and our widget here. So that should be enough to get us started with defining a widget. Finally, we're going to need to add an implementation of hook field formatter info. Let's take a look at the documentation for that. Back over on api.drupal.org, I pull up the information about hook field formatter info, which exposes field API formatter types. This is another information providing hook. It's going to return an array that describes the formatter implemented by our module. Looks very similar to hook widget info. We need a label, a description, and a field type that it'll apply to. All right, so let's go ahead and switch back over to our code. And we can add an implementation of hook field formatter info. This one, again, returns an array. The key here for this is going to be the name of the formatter that we're going to create. So up here in our hook field info, I said that the formatter name was RGB_raw. So I need to make sure and use that key in our return values from our implementation of hook field formatter info. I also need to make sure that I name it properly. So add that field underscore there. And then this is going to be an array. And that array needs to contain a label and the field types that this formatter will apply to. So I'll go ahead and add that. I'm going to say label. We can give our formatter a label of, we'll call this one raw color value. Now, neither our formatter or our widget are actually going to do anything at the moment. We're going to need to define some additional code in a later lesson so that these are executed at the appropriate time. But at this point, Drupal will at least know about the fact that our module is going to provide these things. An RGB color field, as defined by hook field info or our field type. An RGB underscore text field widget, as defined by hook widget info, and an RGB_raw field formatter as defined by hook field formatter info. If I save all of these, I'm going to switch back over to our Drupal site. On our site, we've already got our module enabled, and since I just added these 3 new hooks, I'm going to clear the cache first by going to Configuration, and then Performance, and then Clear All Caches. A lot of this metadata about the field types and widgets and formatters that Drupal makes use of is pretty heavily cached because it doesn't make sense for Drupal to try to rebuild that information on every single page load. So when you add a new implementation of one of these hooks, generally you need to clear the cache so that it's picked up. Now, when I go to the Structure tab and Content Types, and I'm going to go to Manage Fields for our article content type. This would be true of any entity manage fields page though, since the UI here is just provided by the field UI module. Any custom field type is going to show up in this. When I go to the Add New Field section here, I now see the option to select the color field type, which wasn't there by default in Drupal 7. So that we just added, color, and I can choose the RGB text fields widget. Color and RGB text fields here map to the label fields that we added in our hook implementations over in our module. At this point, we're not actually going to be able to add the field because we still need to define more information about each of the field type, widget, and formatters. But you can see that Drupal is starting to recognize it because we've added those info hooks. Let's do a quick review of those info hooks. Back in our code, we added an implementation of hook field info, which describe metadata about the field type, an implementation of hook field widget info, which provided metadata about the widget that we're going to create, and finally hook field formatter info, which provided metadata about the formatter that we're going to define for our custom field type.